A woman gave $10 to a street child. And 10 years later, a millionaire woman knocked on her door with incredible news. The icy afternoon air swept through the streets of Buenos Aires, a relentless gust dragging dust and dry leaves across the sidewalks of the Mataderos industrial zone. The metallic clang of the meatpacking plants resonated in the air, marking the rhythm of life for the working families who came and went from these enormous complexes. Lucia Garcia, 30 years old, hurried towards the metro station, her muscles heavy and aching from endless hours at the meatpacking plant. She had worked there for years, ever since dropping out of high school to help her family. Her life revolved around long days, meager wages, and nights of profound exhaustion. Things hadn't changed much since then. She still worked to survive. Now also to support Sophia, her 6-year-old daughter. Sometimes she felt trapped in a vicious cycle, as if every effort left her in the same place. That day had been particularly grueling. The plant was overwhelmed by high demand, and although the machinery facilitated the process, some tasks still required immense physical effort. Lucia had spent hours lifting enormous trays of meat, and by the end of the day, her arms trembled with exhaustion. Her backpack hung from her shoulder as if it weighed a ton. And each step towards the metro seemed longer than the last. When she reached the station, relief was immediate. She boarded the train and collapsed into one of the empty seats. Grateful for the unusual lack of crowding at that hour, she leaned her head against the window, feeling the train's rattle begin to relax her. All that remained was to get home and see Sophia, who was waiting in the care of a neighbor. Guilt gnawed at her whenever she thought of her daughter. She couldn't be with her as much as she'd like. Necessity forced her to work incessantly, leaving many important moments in the hands of others. But there was no other option. This thought weighed on her constantly. Exhaustion overcame her. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she forced her eyes open to avoid missing her stop. However, at some point, her eyes closed despite her efforts. It was then that she felt something, a slight jolt, as if someone had accidentally touched her. She opened her eyes, blinking to clear her vision, and the first thing she saw was a girl standing in front of her. The girl was about 10 years old. Although extreme thinness and worn clothes made her seem smaller, her face was pale, her eyes sunken, as if cold and hunger had seeped into her bones. She clutched her stomach with her hands, and discomfort was evident in her expression. "Excuse me, I didn't want to bother you, but I'm hungry. Do you have anything to give me?" the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. It took Lucia a few seconds to react. She was still half asleep. But when she processed the girl's words, a knot formed in her stomach. She looked at her more closely and noticed she was freezing. Her lips chapped. At that moment, a low but unmistakable sound came from the girl's stomach. Lucia felt compassion wash over her. The image of Sophia immediately appeared in her mind, and the thought that her daughter could be in a similar situation struck her hard. "And your parents, where are they?" she asked, trying to soften her voice, though she already imagined the answer. The girl looked down, without releasing her grip on her stomach. "I don't know, I haven't seen them in days," she murmured, shrinking as if she wanted to disappear. Lucia felt her heart clench. She knew what it was like to be hungry, but she had never seen such a small girl, alone and in such a state. Trying to ignore the little money she had left, she rummaged in her bag. She pulled out the 2 sandwiches she had prepared that morning for her breaks. They were still neatly wrapped in plastic film, although a bit squashed. She also took out a $10 bill, the last she had until payday. Without thinking too much, she handed him to the girl. "Here, eat this," she said, placing the sandwiches in her hands. "And with this, buy yourself something else, if you can," she added, handing her the bill. The girl looked at the sandwiches with wide eyes, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Tears began to well up in her eyes. She took the food with trembling hands, and although she tried to smile, emotion overwhelmed her. Thank you very much," she murmured without fully raising her head. Before Lucia could say anything else, the girl added, "I'll pay you back, I promise." Lucia smiled, feeling a mixture of sadness and tenderness. She didn't expect anything in return. She knew that those $10 wouldn't solve the girl's situation, but at least she wouldn't go hungry that night. When the subway reached her station, Lucia stood up to get off. She looked one last time at the girl, who was already biting into one of the sandwiches with eagerness, as if she hadn't tasted food in days. "Take care," she said softly before passing through the train doors. That night, as she walked towards her small apartment, the image of the girl lingered in her mind. Where would she sleep? Would anyone else help her? The memory of her hungry expression accompanied her throughout dinner with Sophia. While her daughter recounted her day's activities, Lucia nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but wonder if she had done enough for that girl on the subway. Later, already in bed, exhaustion didn't give her a break. Yet she found it hard to sleep. She closed her eyes and tried to find solace in the idea that at least that night, someone had received a little help. She knew that life was full of difficulties, but also of small moments of kindness that, however insignificant they may seem, can change the course of a story. With that thought, she finally let sleep overcome her, ready to face another day of work at the meatpacking plant. Weeks passed, and Lucia's life continued with the same exhausting routine. She woke up before the sun even peeked over Buenos Aires, preparing a quick breakfast for her daughter, Sophia, before heading off to work. The fatigue was constant, but she endured it for the love of her little girl. Sometimes, while lifting trays of meat or labeling cuts, her mind would wander to that encounter on the subway with the unknown girl. She hadn't seen her again, but her image remained in her thoughts, a persistent shadow. However, one day, her life began to change without her knowing. It was an ordinary afternoon, exhausted like so many others, waiting for the subway that would take her home. Leaning against the train doors, she struggled to keep her balance as the train lurched around each curve. That's when a tall, friendly-looking man approached her. "Want to sit down?" he asked, pointing to a seat that had just become free. Lucia looked up, surprised by the gesture. She wasn't used to someone offering her help. With a tired smile, she accepted. "Thank you. To be honest, it's been a rough day," she said, sinking into the seat. The man returned a warm laugh. "It happens to all of us. We're part of the metro fauna. My name's Esteban, by the way." "Lucia," she replied, without giving it much importance. Yet, something in Esteban's gaze conveyed a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. After that day, they began to meet frequently on the subway. At first, their conversations were light, about the exhausting nature of their jobs or the city's oddities. Lucia told him about her work at the meatpacking plant and about Sophia, who waited for her every afternoon in the care of a neighbor. Esteban, in turn, talked about his job as a maintenance technician at a nearby factory. Over time, those conversations became deeper. He started walking her home from the station, and weeks later, he invited her for coffee. Lucia accepted, and what seemed like a simple friendship soon blossomed into something more. In Esteban, she found someone willing to listen, to understand her struggles, and above all, to share them. "Sophia likes school?" Esteban asked one afternoon as they walked towards her house. "Yes, although she keeps asking to go to the park more often. I'm always rushing," Lucia replied with a smile, though a hint of guilt crept into her voice. "Well, one day I'll take her. We could all go. It doesn't have to be so complicated," he said, looking at her with a mixture of tenderness and sincerity. Lucia felt something loosen in her chest. It had been so long since she had felt accompanied in that way. Over the months, Esteban became a fundamental part of their lives. He helped with household chores and assisted Sophia with her homework. It didn't take long for Sophia to become fond of him. Every time he arrived home, Sophia greeted him with a hug. "Esteban, let's play cards today," she'd ask, tugging on his hand before he could even take off his shoes. "Of course, champion, but don't cheat on me this time, eh?" he'd reply, laughing, swept away by her enthusiasm. Lucia watched these scenes with a mixture of relief and gratitude. Esteban had not only become a partner for her but also the father Sophia had never had. A year after they met, Esteban decided to take a step further. On a simple afternoon, surrounded by the routine they had built together, he took Lucia's hand while Sophia played in the next room. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you," he said with a nervous smile. "I can't offer you luxuries, but I promise I'll take care of you and Sophia. You're my world. Lucia, will you marry me?" Lucia felt tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't expected this moment, but the answer had been clear in her heart for some time. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes," Esteban responded, his voice choked with emotion. They married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by close family and friends. With Esteban by her side, life took a new direction, one full of hope. The difficulties remained, but his presence made everything more bearable. The first years of marriage were happy, and the greatest joy arrived with the birth of Paloma. From the moment she held her in her arms, Lucia knew she would do anything for her new daughter. Esteban, in turn, became a loving and present father, willing to sacrifice for his family. Sofia adored her little sister from day one, approaching the Moses basket where Paloma slept and observing her with fascination. "Paloma, look how pretty you are," she would whisper carefully, stroking her cheek. "When you're older, we'll play together." However, perfect happiness didn't last long. A few years after the wedding, Esteban began complaining of headaches and chest pains. At first, he didn't give it much importance. "It must be stress from work," he'd say lightly, "or that awful food I ate the other day. It must have upset my stomach." Lucia wasn't so convinced. Every time she heard him complain, she felt a knot in her stomach. "Esteban, please go to the doctor. It's not normal for you to hurt so much," she insisted, worried, but he always responded with a smile, trying to reassure her. "Come on, Lucia. If it gets worse, I'll go. It's nothing." However, the symptoms didn't improve, and one Sunday morning, while playing with Sofia and Paloma in the living room, he suffered a sudden heart attack. The pain threw him to the ground. Clutching his chest, Lucia rushed to him, terrified, and called an ambulance. At the hospital, the wait was agonizing. The doctor emerged after a few hours with an expression Lucia would never forget. "I'm very sorry, he didn't survive the second heart attack," he said softly but firmly. Lucia's world crumbled. Esteban was gone, and nothing would ever be the same. She hugged Sofia tightly, tears falling uncontrollably. "Mommy, Daddy will come back?" Paloma asked, her voice broken and full of fear. Lucia closed her eyes, trying to find the words. But it was Sofia who spoke first, with a wisdom that only children possess. "Paloma, Daddy is in heaven now," she said, pulling her little sister into a hug, and the three of them remained there, embracing in silence, weeping for the man who had filled their lives with love. Although it had been a short time, those 4 years with Esteban had been enough to leave an indelible mark on their hearts. The emptiness left by Esteban's death was profound and constant. Lucia woke up each day with the feeling that a part of her had died with him. While she dressed, had breakfast, or prepared to leave for work, her thoughts returned to him again and again. Like an unending echo, Esteban had become her partner, her support, and now she had to move forward alone. But giving up wasn't an option. Her daughters, Sofia and Paloma, needed her. Sofia, barely 10 years old, was finishing elementary school, and Paloma had recently started kindergarten. She couldn't fail them. The pain of loss was still fresh, but the routine advanced relentlessly. The days passed like a thick fog, and the long hours at the meatpacking plant became unbearable. If it had been just exhausting before, now each task felt like an impossible weight. However, the hospital debts and household expenses forced her to accept extra shifts. She barely had time to be with her daughters, and that hurt more than anything. Despite the fatigue, the few hours she had with them were her refuge. Every night after returning from work, she would sit at the edge of Sofia's bed, listening attentively to the details of her day. Then she would make sure both girls had eaten something and tucked Paloma in until the little one closed her eyes. Although her life seemed to be falling apart, those moments with her daughters were the only thing keeping her standing. One Saturday afternoon, Sofia was playing in the neighborhood park with her friends. For weeks, the girl had become enthusiastic about skating, and Lucia, with the little money she had managed to save, had bought her a second-hand pair of skates. It was one of the few joys they had amidst their grief. Every time she saw her daughter smile with those skates on, she felt she had done something right in the midst of so much darkness. That day, the park was full of laughter and shouts. Sofia glided confidently among the trees, enjoying the freedom she felt whenever she skated. Suddenly, she saw the small ramp at the end of the park and decided to try it. "Look at this," she shouted to her friends. Encouraged by the challenge, she climbed without problems, but upon reaching the top, she tripped over a pothole she hadn't seen. The imbalance caused her to fall backward, and the impact against the ground was brutal. The thud resonated sharply, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Sofia lay on the ground, her gaze vacant, her body motionless. Her friends ran to her, but when they saw that she couldn't move, they panicked. "She's not moving. Call an ambulance," one of the girls screamed desperately. The paramedics arrived quickly, carefully immobilized her, and placed her on a stretcher. Barely conscious, Sofia kept murmuring, "I can't feel my legs." Lucia was at work when she received the call. As soon as she heard the words, "accident," and "hospital," she dropped everything and raced to the clinic. She entered the hospital almost breathless, her hands trembling, her heart racing. "Please, my daughter, Sofia Garcia. She was brought in a short time ago after an accident. she said, her voice choked with emotion at the reception desk. Please wait a moment, Mom. The doctor will see you shortly. The receptionist replied calmly. Each minute that passed while waiting felt like an eternity. Finally, a man in a white coat appeared in front of her. I'm Dr. Peralta. I treated your daughter. The doctor began. Lucia felt her legs turn to ice. How is she? Is she going to be okay? She asked desperately. The doctor paused, as if searching for the most careful way to deliver the inevitable. Sophia suffered a serious spinal injury. For now, she's stable, but it's likely she won't walk again. The words fell on Lucia like a tombstone. She felt the air ripped from her body. No, it can't be. Isn't there anything that can be done? The doctor nodded, but his expression didn't show much relief. There's a possibility of recovery with spinal reconstruction surgery. It's a delicate and expensive operation. We're talking about $2, not including the physiotherapy sessions necessary for her rehabilitation. Lucia felt the world crumble. $2 was an impossible sum. She could barely support her family. And the debts from Esteban's death were increasingly overwhelming. I don't have that money. What can I do? She whispered, more to herself than to the doctor. The doctor placed a hand on her shoulder. I understand it's difficult, but we'll do everything possible to keep her stable. If you decide to proceed with the surgery, let us know. When she finally saw her daughter, she found her awake but frightened. She was lying in bed with a neck brace and eyes full of questions. Mom, what's wrong with me? I can't move my legs, Sophia said in a whisper. Lucia sat beside her and took her hand firmly. Calm down, my love. The doctors are doing everything possible to make you better. Everything will be all right, I promise. Sophia nodded slowly, trusting her mother implicitly, although both knew it wasn't an easy promise to keep. The first few days in the hospital were an emotional torture for Lucia. Paloma, who didn't understand the magnitude of what was happening, would cuddle in her mother's arms whenever she saw her cry. During one of the hospital visits, the little one climbed onto Sophia's bed, hugging her. When are you coming home, Sophie? Paloma asked with her usual innocence. Soon, Paloma, I promise, the girl replied, stroking her hair. Although sadness overwhelmed her, seeing her little sister made her feel a little better. One day, while Lucia was arranging Sophia's pillows, the girl asked a question that broke her heart. Mom, if I can't walk again, will I be able to skate again? Lucia felt something break inside her, but she did her best to stay calm. She sat next to her daughter and took her hand. You won't be able to skate, my love. We'll find something else that will make you happy. But no matter what happens, I'll always be with you. Sophia looked away, tightening her lips. Sure, she muttered. The indifference in her tone was almost worse than the sadness. Lucia knew her daughter wasn't saying it to hurt her, but her every word was a reminder of everything she couldn't give her. At night, after putting her daughters to bed, she would sit on the couch, utterly exhausted. In that silence, the emotions she had suppressed during the day would overwhelm her. Tears would fall uncontrollably, and her body would shake with silent sobs. Paloma, who often woke up in the middle of the night, would find her there, crying alone. With her childlike intuition, she would approach quietly and climb onto her lap, cuddling against her as if her presence could alleviate that pain. Don't cry, Mommy, everything will be all right, she would murmur, stroking her face with her soft little hands. Lucia hugged her tightly, grateful for that small spark of tenderness amidst so much chaos. Yes, my love, we'll be all right, she whispered, although inside she wasn't sure if she would be able to keep that promise. Months went by, and the wheelchair became part of the daily routine. Sophia, increasingly distant, avoided talking about the operation, taking refuge in television or isolating herself in her own world. Paloma, refusing to give up, kept trying to get close to her older sister, although the attempts almost always ended in arguments. Do you want me to comb your hair, Sophie? She asked one day, approaching timidly with a brush in her hand. No, Paloma, I don't want to, but if I do it, it'll look pretty. I said no. Paloma, don't you understand? Sophia raised her voice, making the little girl flinch. Lucia arrived just in time to intervene. Sophia, what's going on? Don't talk to your sister like that. She's annoying me, Mom. She never leaves me alone, Sophia shouted, and with those words, she let out some of the frustration she had been accumulating. Lucia felt the weight of that anger, but she also understood that Sophia was struggling with a pain she didn't know how to express. Paloma, her eyes filled with tears, clung to her mother's legs, seeking comfort. It's okay, Paloma, Come with me, Lucia murmured, stroking her hair as she lifted her into her arms. From the doorway, Lucia looked at her older daughter, sitting in her wheelchair, her eyes fixed on the floor. She wanted to approach, hug her, tell her everything would get better. But she knew Sophia needed time to process her own sadness, even if it meant distancing herself from everyone for a while. The woman continued to fight, even though each day left her more exhausted. With each step the weight of responsibility and helplessness grew heavier. Money remained scarce, and sleepless nights filled with worry piled up like bricks on her shoulders. But amidst all that darkness, Lucia clung to the only thing she had left, hope. Though small and fragile, that spark remained alive. She refused to surrender, even when the situation seemed unsustainable. She didn't know how or when, but she would do everything possible to find a way out for Sophia. What she couldn't imagine was that the answer to her prayers was closer than she believed. An act of kindness she had performed years ago was about to return to her life, bringing with it a possibility she never would have imagined, one that could change everything. The Buenos Aires sky was gray, and a light rain fell on the streets as she walked home after another grueling shift at work. Lucia's mind was occupied with the same thoughts that had accompanied her in recent months, her daughter in a wheelchair. Upon opening the door to her small apartment, the first thing she saw was Sophia sitting by the window, watching the rain fall. Her eyes remained fixed on the water sliding down the glass. Lost in some distant point, Lucia sighed. Each day was a silent struggle against the deep sadness that had consumed her daughter since the accident. Sophia, who had once been a whirlwind of energy and laughter, now seemed a shadow of herself. Lucia felt the weight of helplessness on her shoulders like a backpack full of stones. Paloma, her younger daughter, played on the floor with her dolls. The neighbor usually picked her up from kindergarten and cared for her until Lucia returned from work. The little one adapted to the changing routines without problems. But Sophia found it more difficult. She hadn't gone to school in days, she barely left her room. Paloma, loyal to her older sister, preferred to stay home too, as if she sensed Lucia's suffering. Lucia was taking off her coat when a knock on the door startled her. She frowned. She wasn't expecting visitors. Opening it, she found a young woman, about 18 years old, who smiled at her as if she already knew her. She had loose brown hair, and her honey-colored eyes radiated warmth. "Hi, I'm Mariana," she greeted naturally. Lucia offered a polite smile, assuming she was a new neighbor. Her surprise grew upon hearing the next sentence. "We met a few years ago on the subway. I'm sure you don't remember, but I told you I would return the favor someday." Lucia frowned, trying to place her in her memories, while the woman reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled old $10 bill. Memory struck her like a thunderbolt. The girl on the subway, that little girl she had found alone, hungry, and to whom she had given her last few pesos along with a couple of sandwiches. She had thought of her many times, wondering if she had survived, and now she had her in front of her eyes, transformed into a young adult. "Mariana," Lucia whispered incredulously. The young woman's smile widened with a touch of nostalgia. "I never forgot you. That day you changed my life. You didn't have much, but you gave me everything you could." Lucia felt a lump in her throat and was speechless for a moment. All this time, she had thought that encounter had been just a fleeting gesture, something forgotten by the girl mere hours later. And yet, there she was, with the same gratitude in her eyes. "Come in, please," Lucia said, opening the door completely. Mariana entered the apartment with a calm step, but as soon as she saw Sophia in her wheelchair, something in her gaze changed. She didn't ask anything, but Lucia felt she understood everything. "I was lucky," Mariana began to explain, while Lucia closed the door behind them. "I ended up in an orphanage where they helped me. I studied, I worked, and now I'm doing well." Lucia listened in silence, still processing the surprise of the reunion. A part of her couldn't believe that the same girl she had helped was there, transformed into a successful woman. However, beyond the gratitude, something seemed strange. Why had she decided to appear right now? As if reading her mind, Mariana continued, "When I saw your campaign to raise funds for your daughter's surgery, I knew I had to do something. You helped me without expecting anything in return, and I want to repay that favor." Lucia's heart pounded as if it couldn't hold the emotion of what she had just heard. Paloma, who had been following the conversation with curiosity from the floor, got up and approached the young woman. "Are you Mom's friend?" she asked with the seriousness of someone trying to understand the adult world. Mariana knelt down, smiling, and ruffled her hair affectionately. "Something like that." Lucia approached her younger daughter with a gentle smile. Paloma, why don't you go play in your room for a little while? The girl pursed her lips. It's a grown-up conversation. Lucia nodded with a small, contained laugh. Yes, my love, it's a grown-up conversation. Paloma shrugged and disappeared into her room. From the window, Sophia continued to observe the scene in silence. Without missing a detail of what was happening, Lucia hesitated for a second about asking her to leave too, but decided not to. After all, this issue directly affected her. Mariana then said, turning to the young woman, "The surgery is very expensive. I can't accept that you pay for something like this." Mariana took Lucia's hands and held them delicately. "Life has treated me well. Lucia, let me give you back a little of what it took from you." Lucia felt tears well up in her eyes. For months she had fought against despair, feeling that every door she knocked on closed in her face. And now someone she had helped without thinking twice was offering her a way out. The emotion left her speechless for a moment. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, wiping away the tears that were starting to fall. At that moment, Sophia broke her silence. She moved in her wheelchair towards Mariana, looking her intently in the eyes. "What she means is thank you," she said with a shy smile. The first since leaving the hospital. Lucia felt the weight she had been carrying in her chest begin to fade. At least for a moment. There, in the middle of her small apartment, under the dim light of a rainy afternoon, she understood that life, though harsh at times, did give second chances, and perhaps after so long, hers had finally arrived. The routine of the days following Mariana's arrival changed completely. She took charge of managing every detail so that Sophia could have surgery at one of the best clinics in Buenos Aires. She made calls, filled out forms, and moved contacts with surprising naturalness, as if she were used to untangling bureaucratic knots. Lucia, from the sidelines, watched with disbelief. Doors that had always been closed to her now opened easily thanks to Mariana. During those days, Paloma seemed more restless than ever. She ran around the house, dragging her dolls from one side to the other. She loved to approach the table where Mariana and Lucia reviewed papers, rest her head on the edge, and ask with curious eyes, "Why do you make so many calls?" "That helps Sophia." Lucia smiled, stroking her hair. "Yes, my love, Mariana is helping us so that Sophie can have surgery soon. And then we'll celebrate with ice cream," Paloma insisted, as if the surgery were the perfect excuse for a celebration. Mariana laughed and, with a knowing look, replied, "Of course, Paloma, after the operation, we'll get the biggest ice cream you can find." With that, the girl was satisfied and returned to her game. But her constant presence filled the tense moments with light laughter. Even Sophia, who usually kept to herself, smiled occasionally when she saw her sister running around the house with tireless energy. The big day arrived sooner than Lucia expected. Despite her nerves, something inside her remained calm. Now they weren't alone. Mariana was by her side. And in a way, that support made everything more bearable. At the clinic, while they waited in the waiting room, Paloma played with her favorite stuffed animal, a gray rabbit with worn ears. But every so often she would look up curiously. The anxiety in the room was palpable. But so was the hope. Lucia bit her nails nervously while Mariana gave her gentle pats on the shoulder. "Mom, is the surgery over?" Paloma asked for the third time in less than an hour, swinging her legs from her chair. "No, Paloma, we have to wait a little longer," Lucia replied, trying to stay calm. The wait was agonizing, but finally, after several hours, the surgeon came out of the operating room with a calm expression that relieved both women. The surgery was a success. He announced, "Sophia will need a lot of physiotherapy to regain mobility, but we have high hopes that she will walk again." Lucia felt all the weight she had carried for months disappear in an instant. She brought her hands to her face, stifling a sob of relief. And Mariana, excited, hugged her tightly. "Thank you," Lucia whispered, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for everything you did for us." Mariana smiled as she returned the hug. "You don't have to thank me for anything. I'm happy to help you. You helped me first, remember?" Paloma, who had been following the conversation from her chair, tugged on Mariana's arm and looked at her with bright eyes. "Can we go get ice cream now?" she asked with all the seriousness in the world. Mariana and Lucia looked at each other with laughter and tears. "There will be ice cream, Paloma," Mariana promised, ruffling her hair. It wasn't easy. Sophia's muscles were weak after so long without moving. Each stretch was an immense effort, and the exercises left her exhausted and frustrated. Paloma would usually accompany them to the sessions, sitting in a corner with her rabbit, watching everything with attention. Every so often, she would utter a phrase that unexpectedly brought a smile to everyone's faces. "Come on, Sophia, it's like when we race in the hallway. You can win here too," she'd say, unaware of how much her words helped. Lucia, who suffered in silence watching her older daughter's effort, remained firmly by her side. Every time Sophia doubted, she would take her hand and whisper, "Come on, my love, I know you can, just a little more." Mariana was also always present. Like an unwavering pillar, she not only contributed financially but had become part of the family. She arrived at the sessions with contagious energy, encouraging Sophia with encouraging words and affectionate gestures that made her feel loved. "Today was difficult, but tomorrow will be better," she would say after each session. "We're all proud of you." On more than one occasion, Paloma would approach after the exercises, caressing Sophia's leg with disarming tenderness. "You're doing great, Sophia, soon you'll be able to run with me again," she would say with a confidence that seemed to make her forget the pain of the moment. Weeks passed between exercises, doctor's visits, and family moments that renewed their hope. Recovery was slow, but every advance, however small, felt like a shared victory. The bond between them had strengthened, and now they were more than friends, they were a family. Mariana had become indispensable in their lives, almost like a younger sister to Lucia and a beloved aunt to the girls. The house, which had once been filled with uncomfortable silences and sadness, now vibrated with laughter, games, and small moments of everyday happiness. One day, during one of the sessions, the physiotherapist asked Sophia to try to stand up using the parallel bars. Fear and excitement mixed on her face as she grasped the bars with both hands. Lucia watched with her heart in her throat, knowing how important this moment was. Sophia, with visible effort, began to rise. Her legs trembled, and it seemed as if she would collapse at any moment. But she didn't. With each passing second, she clung more firmly to the bars, and slowly she managed to straighten her body. "You're doing it, Sophia," Lucia shouted, tears in her eyes. "I told you we were going to run again." "Sophie knew it," said Paloma, and she threw herself at her, hugging her tightly. Mariana, who was also present, covered her mouth with her hands, surprised and moved to see the girl who had suffered so much begin to stand up on her own. Sophia smiled with effort, her face sweaty but full of determination, although she only managed to stand for a few seconds before having to sit down again. The progress was undeniable. "I'm going to beat you. Like always," she replied to her sister. The smile she dedicated could have illuminated the darkest night. Lucia, watching the scene, felt the pieces of her life finally falling back into place. The road was still long, but now they were accompanied, with Mariana by their side, and her daughters fighting together. The future looked more promising than ever, because although pain and difficulties hadn't completely vanished, they were no longer alone, and together they knew they could face anything that came their way. As the months passed, Sophia's progress became increasingly noticeable. From needing complete assistance, she went on to walk short distances with the help of a walker. Each achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated in the house as if they had won a championship. Paloma always made sure to be the first to celebrate. "Go, Sophia, take one more step, and you'll win a giant hug," the girl would exclaim, opening her arms wide as if she were going to crush her sister affectionately. Sophia, concentrating, advanced slowly but firmly, holding onto the walker while Lucia and Mariana watched proudly from the doorway. Upon completing the journey, Paloma ran to her and enveloped her in a hug so tight that they both ended up laughing on the floor. "I told you you could, Sophia," Paloma shouted as if she were her personal trainer. "Yes, Paloma, I understand," Sophia replied, laughing, adjusting her hair, which her sister had disheveled mercilessly. "You're worse than the physiotherapists." On quieter nights, when Paloma was asleep and Sophia retreated to her room, Lucia and Mariana would sit in the kitchen with a steaming mate in hand. The trust between them had grown, and those talks had become a kind of ritual. "I always wondered what had become of you after that day on the subway," Lucia confessed one night, casting a nostalgic glance at the past. "I'm so glad to know you were able to move on." Mariana stirred the yerba before responding, as if searching for the right words. "It was difficult, but that day, your gesture gave me the hope I needed. I realized that there were still good people in the world, and that's when I decided that if I could ever, I would return that kindness." Lucia looked at her with a gentle smile, feeling a deep connection with this young woman who had come into her life like an unexpected gift. You did, Mariana. You gave us more than you imagine, she said, taking another sip of mate. It's not just the money, it's that you're here with us. Mariana returned the smile without needing to add anything more. There was a mutual understanding that went beyond words. The circle had closed, and both knew it. The day Sophia took her first steps without the walker was unforgettable. 7 months had passed since the operation, and each day had been a mixture of challenges and small triumphs. That afternoon, they had decided to do physiotherapy in the park for a change of scenery. The change gave Sophia the energy to try. She stood up with Lucia on one side and Mariana on the other, gently supporting her arms. Paloma, who was playing nearby, looked up just in time to see her sister rise with determination. She left her stuffed rabbit lying on the floor and approached, jumping with excitement. Go, Sophia, you can do it. One more step, and you're there, the girl shouted. Sophia, biting her lip, advanced slowly but surely, 1 foot forward, then the other. Her breathing was heavy, but her eyes shone with determination. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, she took a full step without support. Look, Mom, I'm walking, Sophia exclaimed with a mixture of surprise and joy. Lucia felt tears welling up uncontrollably. She squeezed her daughter's hand tightly as her heart filled with pride and relief. You're doing it, my love, you're doing it, she said, unable to contain her emotion. Mariana also had tears in her eyes, as if she shared every second of that victory with them. She couldn't help but think about how a small gesture, those $20 and the sandwiches from years ago, had triggered a story full of hope. Paloma jumped and ran to her sister. I told you, Sophia, now you have to beat me in the races, she said, giving her an oversized hug that almost knocked them both over. Sophia let out a laugh, holding onto Mariana's arm to avoid falling completely. Easy, Parley, I'm just starting to walk, she said, laughing, but with a happiness she hadn't shown in months. Over time, Sophia stopped using the walker completely and only needed occasional physiotherapy. Every time she managed to walk a little faster or support herself for longer without help. The house filled with laughter and impromptu celebrations. Life had returned with more force than ever, and that joy was palpable in every corner of the home. One afternoon, while they were all strolling together through a nearby park, Paloma was running between the trees, collecting leaves and chasing pigeons with her typical enthusiasm. Lucia and Mariana walked slowly, enjoying the sun and the comfortable silence that had settled between them. You realize, Lucia said suddenly, breaking the calm, I never thought such a small gesture could have such a big impact. You taught me that everything we do has an echo, even if we don't see it at first. Mariana looked at her sideways with that warm smile that was already familiar to her. You gave me much more than you think, Lucia replied, and I'm happy to have been able to give you a little of that back. In front of them, Paloma came running back, waving a branch as if it were a sword. Come on, you guys have to run too. The last one to reach the bench is a snail. Sophia, who was now walking with ease, gave a defiant look. This time I'm beating you, Parley, she said, and ran after her sister. Lucia and Mariana followed at a slower pace, watching as the two girls ran and laughed, without worrying about anything more than that moment. The future, which had once seemed uncertain, now seemed full of possibilities. They had shown that even in the most difficult moments, kindness and love could open paths to new beginnings, and together they knew they could face whatever came their way. The warm days of Buenos Aires brought that light breeze that moves the leaves as if they struggled to detach themselves from the branches. The strong but kind sun covered the park where Lucia, Sophia, Paloma, and Mariana walked together, enjoying a calm that seemed impossible to achieve a few years ago. Almost 2 years had passed since Sophia walked again, and although life had tested them in every possible way, they now moved forward with the certainty that the worst was behind them. Lucia felt renewed. The pain of Esteban's death was still present, but it no longer dominated her. The debts, the endless days at the meatpacking plant, and the nights crying in silence had become scars. They ached occasionally, but they also reminded her how far she had come. Sophia, now 15 years old, walked proudly beside her mother and her aunt, because for her, Mariana was like an aunt. The little girl who had been confined to a wheelchair had recovered not only her legs but also her spirit. And Paloma ran around them all, jumping over the puddles left by the previous day's rain. They stopped in front of a worn wooden bench, the same one where Sophia had taken her first steps after the operation. Mariana, with her usual smile, sat down without thinking twice, patting the space next to her for Sophia to join. Do you remember this place? She asked. Sophia kicked a small stone with the tip of her foot. Distractedly. How could I not? She replied, smiling. It was the day you got out of the wheelchair and started walking. Sophia nodded with a smile that mixed nostalgia and satisfaction. That was the best day of my life. And for me too, Mariana added. That day I understood that everything we had gone through was worth it. Lucia, who had been listening from a few steps behind, approached slowly and sat next to them. She looked at her older daughter, now full of energy, and felt an emotion that tightened her chest. Can you believe how much has changed since then? She said, looking up at the sky as if searching for the right words. There was a moment when I thought we weren't going to make it. But look where we are. Paloma, who had been jumping in puddles without stopping, ran to her sister and climbed onto her back, laughing. Sophia, carry me. Sophia snorted. Stop it, Parley, I'm not a horse. Paloma crossed her arms, making a pout. But you can walk now. Before you couldn't even get up. And now you don't want to carry me? Lucia suppressed a smile, and Mariana burst into a laugh, amused by the little girl's crushing logic. Let her be. Sophia, look, Paloma's right, Mariana said, winking at the youngest. Sophia rolled her eyes but ended up giving in with a smile. Okay, but hold on tight, I'm not up for any craziness. She lifted her just a few inches, making her laugh heartily. Lucia looked at her two daughters together, and in her chest she felt the same mixture of relief and gratitude that had accompanied her since Sophia started walking again. Mariana, sitting next to her, watched in silence, as if she perfectly understood what she was feeling. You know, you're like the older sister I never had, Mariana said, giving her a friendly nudge with her shoulder. Lucia looked at her sideways, surprised by the confession but moved. Older sister, you say? Don't make me feel old. Well, I didn't say you were old, just that you're a little older than me, Mariana replied, letting out a chuckle. Lucia laughed, shaking her head. Mariana turned serious for a moment, although her smile remained present. Seriously, Lou, you don't know how important you are to me. Without you, I wouldn't be here. When you found me on the subway that time, you changed my life. You gave me the hope I needed to move forward. That's why, no matter what happens, wherever you are, that's where I'll be. Lucia felt tears welling up in her eyes. But this time they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of gratitude, relief, and love for this friendship that had been born from the simplest gesture. Without hesitation, she hugged her tightly, feeling that this bond was unbreakable. Thank you, Mariana, for everything. You don't know what it means to have you here. You're my family. You always were my family, Mariana replied, squeezing her tightly as they continued chatting on the bench. Paloma slid out of her sister's hug and stood in front of them with her arms akimbo. I have an idea. Why don't we all live together? That way we're always close. Mariana laughed, looking at the little girl affectionately. That's not a bad idea, Parley. I bought the house near here, so we'll be a couple of blocks away, Sophia said, surprised and excited. For many years she had longed for a bigger family. She didn't know her grandparents because they had kicked Lucia out when she got pregnant. And she didn't know her biological father because he had abandoned them. The only father she had truly loved was no longer there. The thought of her aunt living nearby made her happy. Her mom would have a friend, and she would have a bigger family. Yes, I'm staying here forever, Mariana responded. This is my place, and I don't plan on missing a single day of their lives. Sophia smiled with all the sincerity in the world. That's the best thing you could tell us. The days in the park became a routine. Sophia and Paloma enjoyed playing, and Lucia and Mariana walked together, talking about life, dreams, and everyday things. Now, with less economic pressure thanks to both of their steady work, life allowed them to breathe a little easier. Lucia had even met Francisco, a co-worker who seemed nice. The ghost of Esteban still hurt, but she was sure he would have wanted her to move on. One of those afternoons of chatting, Sophia stopped suddenly and looked at her mother and Mariana. You know what I want to be when I grow up? She asked with a twinkle in her eyes. What do you want to be? Lucia asked curiously. I want to be a doctor. I want to help other people. Like you helped me. The woman felt pride fill her heart, and she stroked her daughter's hair. You're going to be the best doctor in the world, Sophia. I have no doubt. Mariana nodded with a broad smile. You know it, and when you graduate, we're going to have the biggest party in the neighborhood. The three of them fell silent for a moment, enjoying the wind that caressed their skin and the sun that illuminated every corner of the park. They had weathered storms that had tested them, But together they had found a way to move forward. They knew that the path ahead could bring new challenges. But now they were ready to face everything as a family. As friends. As women who had learned that even in the darkest moments, there is always room for hope. And so, walking together under the sun, they knew their future was full of possibilities.